Their collective determination, forged through years of forensic study, forms the dark heart of our investigation. This is no mere conjecture. It is a definitive conclusion built from evidence that existed before the first clock even ran out. It predates the second deadline and the public realization. The truth is simple and terrifying. This was never about a ransom. Experts suggest a much more sinister reality. We begin where others stop, by examining 8 veteran law enforcement officers. This panel includes former federal agents, a retired Pima County detective, and a veteran SWAT commander. A former state trooper specialized in cold cases has also provided this same haunting assessment on the record. They aren't hiding behind anonymity. These are named individuals giving verified statements to reputable news outlets. To a person, they reject the narrative that this was a functional kidnapping for financial gain. Former Special Agent Harry Trombitis informed the press that the ransom theory is losing foundation due to the operation's complexity. There are simply too many points of failure. Retired Agent Andrew Bringwell shared a similar skepticism regarding the perpetrator's motives. He told Newsweek the evidence suggests an abduction that turned fatal during capture, rather than a completed ransom plot. Kurt Dabb, whose career was built in the Pima County Homicide Division, offered an even bleaker assessment. He told Parade that this was a deliberate abduction, not a random crime or a house call gone wrong. It was a tactical operation involving 2 to 4 individuals who had conducted prior surveillance on a very specific human target. Morgan Wright, a veteran detective who now leads a center for unsolved cases, took it even further. He stated publicly that this is no longer a search for a missing person, using the clinical term, a nobody homicide. She retired for the evening as usual, an 84-year-old woman simply exhausted after a long day with her grandchildren. She likely left a door unsecured, a small oversight that provided the perfect opening for a pre-planned, predatory snatch. When discussing these professionals, it is important to distinguish them from the armchair detectives found online. These are not hobbyists or people chasing clicks with wild theories. These are individuals who have managed federal ransom cases. They understand the cold mechanics of this specific brand of violence. When someone like Trombitis claims a ransom is unlikely, it is because he has spent a lifetime seeing the real thing. Bringwell isn't guessing. He is looking back at a 1991 case. In Alabama, he worked as a young field agent. That investigation started as a ransom plot, but ended in murder before a single dollar ever changed hands. He isn't speculating from a distance. He is recognizing a pattern. When Kurt Dabb looks at the evidence, he sees precision. He patrolled the very Pima County streets, where she vanished, and is now applying his local expertise to the scene. When he identifies a multi-person team and a targeted hit, he isn't playing a game. He is deciphering a crime scene. When experts of this caliber put their reputations on the line publicly, it is no longer a fringe idea. It is a professional consensus that demands our attention. The real mystery we are exploring today isn't their accuracy, but the reasoning behind their certainty. Why do 8 elite investigators look at the ransom notes and the empty Bitcoin wallet and see something different? Why, despite the family's desperate promise to pay, do they conclude that the situation was a carefully constructed facade? To understand their perspective, we must examine the brutal logic of a genuine ransom kidnapping and where this case deviates. A professional abduction for profit follows a very specific, cold-blooded set of rules. It is a business transaction of the most horrific kind, where every moving part serves a singular purpose: the exchange. The captive must remain alive, not for humanitarian reasons, but because a corpse offers no bargaining power to the captors. You cannot trade a ghost for cash. The moment the victim perishes, the leverage vanishes, and the entire scheme disintegrates. There is no deal to close, only the risk of being caught with a body, the ultimate evidence for a conviction. A professional operative guards their victim like a high-security vault, because without the contents, the key is worthless. The target is merely the centerpiece. The real work lies in the absolute control of every outward communication. Providing proof of life isn't a gesture of empathy for a grieving family. It is the fundamental mechanism that converts a desperate threat into a valid business transaction. Absent that confirmation, no rational person would authorize a payment. Without it, the ticking clock carries no psychological weight. Without proof, the agreement dissolves. The logistics of the transfer must be perfectly functional, even when dealing with digital assets like Bitcoin, a currency that some offenders mistakenly view as an invisible ghost. though the intricate process of accepting and securing those funds and laundering them without detection demands meticulous foresight. Modern blockchain investigators can now observe wallet movements in real time. Federal agencies possess the technology to map the flow of every digital token. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, paired with private forensic specialists, has dismantled networks far more sophisticated than a single digital address leaked to a local news station. The belief that using Bitcoin renders a payoff untraceable is, in the eyes of a professional analyst, a fatal misunderstanding of the technology. Every Bitcoin transfer is etched permanently into a transparent, public ledger for the world to see. Every digital movement is recorded. Every wallet carries a traceable lineage, and the exit strategy must be flawless. When you abduct someone for profit, you are essentially maintaining a witness who can eventually identify your face and describe the very walls where they were held, ultimately leading detectives to every accomplice. The choice to release the victim or to keep them is the most perilous moment of any extortion plot. Success requires a precise plan for the chaotic minutes following the movement of the money. Actual kidnappings for ransom within the United States are incredibly rare because managing all these variables simultaneously is nearly impossible. An expert in the field recently noted that these types of financial abductions have seen a significant decline over the last several decades. The heavy infrastructure it demands, the hidden location, the constant management of information, the financial laundering, and the escape plan exceeds the operational limits of almost every modern criminal. One veteran investigator, reflecting on his career in federal law enforcement, noted a haunting historical parallel to this specific mystery. He observed that the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie shared a dark DNA with the 1991 abduction of Carrie Lawson, a young lawyer from Alabama taken by a man named Jerry Bland, who initially aimed for a payday. Early on, the extortion framework seemed intact. Messages were being sent. Demands were clear. There was a genuine expectation that a payoff would occur. But before the money could ever change hands, Bland murdered Lawson, concealed her body, and then took his own life. The investigation ended with no money moved, and Carrie Lawson's remains never found. The expert suggested that in that case, and perhaps this one, it may have started as a traditional kidnapping for profit. Note the use of the past tense, a strategy that began with one intent, but spiraled into something else entirely because the victim did not survive the opening stage. Keep that framework in your mind. Remember the rigid requirements of a ransom plot and the void that forms when the catalyst for the deal vanishes. Then, look at the cold reality of what transpired in Tucson, Arizona, on the night of January 31st, 2026. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She suffered from spinal pain so debilitating that walking to her own mailbox was a physical struggle. She lived with a serious, well-documented heart condition. She relied on a pacemaker and a strict pharmaceutical schedule that her doctors and the local sheriff confirmed was vital. Skipping those pills wasn't a minor oversight. It was, according to the lead investigators, a potentially lethal scenario. She was last seen on that final night in January when her son-in-law dropped her home in the foothills just before 10 o'clock. As her garage door lowered at approximately 9:50 p.m., the invisible clock that truly defines this entire case began its countdown. Investigative details confirmed by law enforcement paint a chilling picture of what happened next. At 1:47 a.m., on February 1st, her doorbell camera was cut. By 2:28 a.m., the pacemaker app on her phone lost its heartbeat. That leaves a 41-minute window. The camera goes dark, and 41 minutes later, the electronic pulse of an 84-year-old woman goes silent. Consider the psychological weight of a pacemaker disconnecting from a phone in the middle of a suspected kidnapping. It points to only three chilling possibilities. Either the phone was moved away, Nancy was taken beyond the reach of the signal, or her heart simply stopped beating. In any of those three scenarios, the internal logic of a ransom demand is already shattered. You cannot sustain a negotiation for a captive whose medical monitor has flatlined in the dead of night. You cannot offer proof of life when you have lost the digital thread that confirms a life still exists. That 2:28 a.m. timestamp is when the ransom theory died. It didn't end weeks later when the deadlines were ignored. It didn't end on day 58 when the digital wallet remained empty. It ended at 2:28 in the morning. While the family slept, the engine of the operation went silent. The entire sequence of events, the demands, the digital paper trail, the looming time limits rested upon a foundation of absolute quiet. Within the grim mathematics of a kidnapping, such a void suggests the transaction was fundamentally broken from the start. Global attention focused intensely on that specific crypto address after the media outlet received the initial ransom instructions. Tucked inside the message was a unique string of characters for a digital wallet. Once the outlet confirmed its validity, a public vigil began. The captors demanded several $1 million in cryptocurrency, setting the primary cutoff for 5 p.m. on Thursday, February 5th. A secondary fallback date was etched into the same text. Monday, February 9th. Using social media as a platform, Savannah and her siblings, Cameron and Annie, issued a direct plea to those holding their mother captive. They stated they had acknowledged the demands and were pleading for her safe return so they could reunite as a family. Desperate to cooperate, they insisted her life was priceless and that they were exhausting every possible resource to secure the funds. They signaled their readiness to negotiate, yet those public words served as a binding intent to fulfill a high-stakes exchange. Under the gaze of a global audience, the first window of time closed. The digital ledger remained untouched. The second deadline arrived and vanished. Yet the wallet balance did not move. 1 month passed with zero activity. By day 58, persistent tracking proved the designated address had never seen a single confirmed transfer. This brings us to the central flaw that dismantles the theory of a standard financial motive. If the objective was truly wealth, why deny the family any mechanism to pay? There was never any evidence she was still alive. Despite the family's frantic public appeals for a sign, the silence was total, violating the most basic tenets of police negotiation. Standard protocol dictates that no ransom is ever wired without verified confirmation that the victim remains alive. This is not about being difficult. It is because that proof is the only leverage that sustains the dialogue. It is the vital collateral a kidnapper offers. Without that essential validation, the family was paralyzed, unable to proceed even with the necessary funds at their fingertips. They had even confirmed their financial readiness on air, a point later emphasized by legal experts to the press. Had the threats been authentic and the family's willingness to pay genuine, the total lack of vital confirmation or logistical guidance suggests a much darker reality behind the curtain. The authors of those notes likely had no proof to offer either because the victim was already gone or they were never involved in her disappearance. Either path leads to the same dead end for the theory of a profit-driven crime. The scheme was hollow. The digital account was destined to remain empty. The intruder seen on the porch arrived with a heavy pack, not an empty sack intended for loot. He carried that weighted bag from the shadows to the door of an 84-year-old woman at 2 a.m, a detail noted by veteran homicide detectives. Investigators who knew those streets intimately shared their professional skepticism with the media regarding the typical behavior of thieves. Real burglars do not show up for a job with a full load. They argued this looked far more like a premeditated snatch and grab. Federal profiling experts agreed, stating the evidence pointed away from a simple theft that had spiraled out of control. The residence could have been hit while empty. Professional thieves study house patterns to avoid direct confrontation with owners. They do not typically break in at 2 a.m. when the occupant is almost certainly sleeping in their bed. Burglary is about the property, but abduction is about the person. You strike when the target is present because they are the objective. Yet, the contents of that pack were not the most chilling detail. It was the fact that he had been there before. Weeks before the disappearance, a masked figure or perhaps an accomplice was recorded by the home's smart security system. There was no forced entry or obvious disturbance at the time. The figure simply lingered at the entrance, seemingly mapping out the camera's blind spots before vanishing into the night. Security specialists later identified a nearby abandoned property as a likely staging ground for the operation. This base would have allowed the perpetrators to track her daily routines and movements from the safety of the shadows. Experts noted that occupying such a spot provided the perfect tactical vantage point to study the victim's habits. A veteran journalist covering the case highlighted a geographical detail that many had overlooked. After spending over 40 days on the ground in that specific neighborhood, he discovered how difficult the landscape truly was. Even after weeks of familiarity, he still required navigation tools. The foothills at night become a disorienting maze. The streets are a silent tangle of desert roads with no clear markers to guide a stranger. Yet, the person who arrived that February morning moved through the darkness with a chilling, calculated precision. This was no journey into the unknown. The perpetrators had scouted the terrain repeatedly. Every maneuver the staging, the meticulous preparation suggested a haunting familiarity with the property. Their effortless navigation and the calculated bypass of security cameras reveal a chilling level of reconnaissance. This was not a desperate, spur-of-the-moment snatch for cash. We are looking at a clinical operation built around a pre-selected target, a slow-burn plot brought to life by a team who shared the burden of logistics. Experts analyzing the tactical timeline believe the execution required a coordinated crew of 2 to 4 individuals. The sheer complexity of this abduction is beyond the capabilities of a lone actor. Given the facts, it took a small cell of 2 to 4 people. It took weeks of quiet, patient observation. A specific victim, a bag loaded with specialized tools, nothing about this crime was reactive. It was a cold, clinical sequence. There was no luck involved. The architecture of this crime was built from the ground up, with the perpetrators knowing their objective from the first second. There is one singular, physical barrier at the Guthrie residence that the public narrative has largely ignored: the front security gate. Reports from March indicate that investigators, after dissecting the home's defenses, reached a dark and specific realization. That heavy gate at the entrance was effectively impossible to compromise from the exterior. It was built to withstand brute force. You cannot simply slip past it. Yet, footage shows a masked figure leading Nancy through that threshold and away from her sanctuary. The math is simple. Either an accomplice on the inside turned the lock, or it was left open for them. This structural reality birthed a terrifying theory now circulating within law enforcement. The ghost captured on the porch was never working alone. A second shadow was already lurking within the house. While the masked intruder played his part for the lens, he was merely the visible element. The accomplice stayed in the darkness, safely out of the camera's sightlines. This was no standard forced entry. It was a synchronized, two-pronged strike, with at least one operative positioned inside before the clock even started. Consider the immense logistics required for such a feat. Planting a person inside that home without alerting the family demands a level of sophistication that far outweighs any impulsive kidnapping scheme. It requires deep, perhaps intimate, access. It suggests a masterfully executed deception or a hidden flaw in the home's security that they had identified and exploited during weeks of surveillance. It leaves us staring at a massive, unanswered void in the official investigation. If an intruder was already waiting in the silence of the home before the man on the porch appeared, who were they? How did they slip in? And more importantly, how long had they been crouched in the shadows? Crime scene technicians found blood, Nancy's blood. It was stained onto the front door, the porch, and the concrete of the driveway. Curiously, the scene did not show signs of a major physical struggle in the traditional sense. There were no tip tables, no indicators of a desperate room-to-room confrontation. All that remained was the blood. A forensic analysis of the evidence explains why this distinction matters more than it first appears. Her investigation did not focus on the red marks, but on the voids, the places where the blood was absent. When a person moves through a blood-spattered area, their body interrupts the spray and leaves telltale gaps. These blank spaces are the negative space of a crime scene, known as voids. They allow analysts to track a victim's movement. In this case, there were no patterns indicating she walked out of that house. Experts strongly doubt she walked. The blood was concentrated in a specific, large sphere, yet it remained undisturbed. There should have been a footprint here, a heel mark there, but the pattern appeared to be hauntingly continuous. This likely explains why the front mat was missing. It was taken to hide the fact that no footsteps ever crossed it. The conclusion is grim. She was likely bundled into a wrap and carried out of the residence. Nancy Guthrie was lifted from her own home. The lack of voids tells a chilling secondary story. Had she been standing, even if she were being marched out at gunpoint, her gait would have broken the blood's surface tension. The human stride leaves a definitive, forensic signature when moving through a fluid. The total absence of that signature proves she was never upright or mobile. She was either unconscious, restrained horizontally, or both. She was wrapped and hauled through that gate, across the porch, and down the drive toward whatever nightmare came next. Private security consultants had already pieced together this tactical profile before the forensics even confirmed the theory. Their final assessment is chilling. The objective of this operation was never a quick kill. It was a capture. Had execution been the primary objective, the intruder possessed the means to end a life right there on the threshold. He stood before the door, masked and armed, yet he chose not to trigger a fatal outcome in that moment. The weapon served as a tool for abduction, a cold instrument of control that failed to bridge the gap between his dark design and the messy reality that followed. Setting aside the question of whether anything of value was taken, the prevailing theory suggests a kidnapping gone wrong, a calculated snatching that spiraled into chaos. Physical conflict erupted, leaving her wounded but breathing, leading to the one revelation that unspools the entire mystery. It appears the assailant failed to account for the victim's resolve. Her defiance likely triggered a violent pivot. In her fragile state, even a momentary lapse into brutality could have authored a tragedy far beyond the kidnapper's original blueprint. An 84-year-old woman, tethered to a pacemaker and burdened by a failing heart, chose to fight back. In that friction of resistance, the orchestrated plan shattered. The physical evidence tells a chilling story. Stains on the porch, and a medical device that ceased its rhythm at exactly 2:28 a.m. The stationary wallet signals the death of the ransom narrative. By the time the demands surfaced, the true horror was already a matter of history. Consider the timeline of events. She vanished into the shadows on the night of January 31st. Her internal clock stopped forever at 2:28 a.m. on February 1st, long before the digital demands for cryptocurrency began to circulate. The ultimatums and threats were merely echoes of a crime already committed in after effect rather than a motive. The 41 minutes between 1:47 and 2:28 a.m. hold the secret, occurring well before the first word of a ransom note was ever typed. Public statements later confirmed that a significant portion of the communications sent to the family were nothing more than cruel fabrications. These were the works of vultures, digital scavengers, looking to profit from a tragedy under the national spotlight. Only a pair of messages garnered any real attention from those closest to the case. A lingering suspicion remains that those specific contacts held some weight of truth, however disturbing. Authorities eventually detained a man from California, named Derek Kalla, charging him with exploiting the investigation through hollow threats. Veteran investigators view these parasitic interactions as an inevitable, albeit sickening, reality when a disappearance captures the public imagination. They act as a smokescreen, draining vital manpower and diverting focus from the actual trail. This white noise drowns out the forensic truth, casting doubt even on the messages that felt legitimate to the grieving family. Despite the engagement with those few credible leads, the silence remained absolute. No evidence of life ever emerged. No deal was ever struck. Desperate pleas for a sign that she was still breathing were met with nothing but an empty void. Successive deadlines expired in agonizing silence. Later, whispers of an uncorroborated report surfaced in late March. Though never validated by federal or local agencies, this alleged message shifted the tone from a demand to something far more somber. It was a confession of sorts, claiming she had succumbed to a fatal heart episode while held against her will. The message suggested the captors were ill-prepared for the fragility of the life they had stolen. Official channels remained silent on the validity of this supposed communication. Yet, the details align perfectly with the theory of a botched abduction, a scenario where the reality of the crime far outpaced the perpetrator's control. The leverage for a ransom had evaporated the moment the victim's heart stopped beating. These messages originated from either those standing over a tragedy or strangers weaving lies from a distance. Ultimately, the ransom notes were a distraction, a sideshow to the darker reality at the core. The heart of the mystery remains locked within those 41 minutes of pre-dawn silence inside the residence. Beyond the criminal element, the behavior of the authorities provides its own set of cryptic clues. Their tactical silence mirrors the grim conclusions reached by outside specialists. During public briefings, local leadership hinted at a specific motive for the breach, yet they meticulously guarded the details from the public. This calculated reticence suggests they have a target in sight, but are waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This is not the behavior of an agency wandering in the dark. It is the disciplined silence of a team building a case designed to survive a courtroom. Questions regarding the handling of the search began to circulate among the professional intelligence community. Many wondered why local law enforcement rebuffed specialized teams eager to scour the harsh landscape. Renowned volunteer organizations stood ready to deploy their sophisticated resources. These units offered the exact level of forensic searching required, yet their help was inexplicably turned away. The refusal was absolute, sparking sharp theories about what the police might already know. Do authorities already have a suspect in their sights? It appears they might already grasp the dark reality of Nancy's fate, opting to preserve specialized search assets rather than squandering them on a futile effort. This theory warrants a deeper, more unsettling examination. Should the official perspective have quietly transitioned from a standard disappearance to a homicide investigation lacking a physical victim, if intelligence suggests their objective is no longer a rescue, but the recovery of hidden, cold remains? In that scenario, utilizing teams trained exclusively for life-saving rescues would be an exercise in tactical futility and a misallocation of vital energy. Such a move would yield nothing of value while prematurely tipping the hand of the police, exposing a grim theory they aren't yet prepared to voice to the world. A former veteran of the Bureau once touched upon the relentless mental burden that weighs on federal agents tasked with such chilling disappearances. Files of this nature are never truly closed, they simply haunt those assigned to them. The true struggle for an investigator is the impossible task of walking away at night, trying to silence the mind long enough to find rest. You find yourself bolting upright at 3 a.m, gripped by the realization that every lost second is a betrayal of the victim. A mind conceived this act. A hand carried it out. Somewhere, a person carries the absolute truth of those 41 missing minutes. Investigations fueled by such calculated malice, involving hidden partners and careful orchestration, littered with digital footprints, physical evidence, and forensic traces, rarely remain in the shadows indefinitely. If the motive wasn't financial gain, then what was the catalyst? On the 19th of March, the 47th day of the agonizing search, a seasoned expert broke the silence with a chillingly clinical assessment. Drawing on 18 years of tactical experience, he voiced the grim reality that others were too hesitant to acknowledge, refusing to let a flawed narrative dictate the search. This was never a simple, botched robbery. We are looking at a specific, premeditated kidnapping that failed a scenario far more sinister than a mere property crime. A standard break-in leaves a predictable mess. It does not leave behind a meticulously curated and artificial crime scene. When the scene feels manufactured, it suggests the original leverage the victim's life has been lost, shifting the entire case into the realm of a homicide without a body. Consider the nuance. The expert isn't dismissing the demand for money entirely. He argues that the ransom was merely the tool, not the core motivation. The true objective of any abduction is the acquisition of absolute power over another. The financial demand was simply the avenue chosen to weaponize that power for a specific result. Yet, that leverage vanishes the moment the victim ceases to breathe. Once survival is no longer part of the equation, the kidnapping narrative dissolves. What remains is the aftermath of a precision strike that turned fatal. A homicide case without a body is a complex legal category that, as federal records indicate, almost inevitably disguises itself as a disappearance in its early stages. This specific classification forces detectives to accept the heavy truth. They are no longer tracking a wanderer. Their focus shifts to uncovering a crime where the most vital proof has been deliberately buried. In these types of cases, the search shifts toward the earth itself, looking for hidden pits, makeshift burials, and shadows in the terrain. These are the subtle, disturbing anomalies one must scan for when traversing the lonely desert outskirts. Such a pivot fundamentally alters the geography of the investigation and the specific, grim details shared with the community. The analyst further explained why the perpetrators would have severed all contact if Nancy had perished during the initial grab. Any further communication would have acted as a confession, escalating their charges from abduction to the far more severe category of felony murder. The cold logic of a killer who has already crossed the ultimate line is simple and terrifying. They realize that total silence offers a better chance of survival than any form of engagement, and so they vanish into the void. Accounts remain untouched. Deadlines come and go in haunting silence. That missing proof of life wasn't a bluff, it was a physical impossibility. It was a void that could not be filled. When questioned about the underlying catalyst, another seasoned investigator offered a narrow range of possibilities. It could stem from a deep-seated thirst for vengeance, explosive rage, or perhaps a motive so personal it remains invisible to the outside eye. A private grudge, likely long-simmering, probably drove the kidnapping, making any talk of money nothing more than a convenient smokescreen for the real objective. The sheer complexity of the plot, the prolonged surveillance, the breach of security, and the seamless coordination among multiple actors, the skill required to maneuver through the pitch-black desert landscape is not the hallmark of an amateur seizing a chance. It is the signature of a person driven by a profound purpose, a motive powerful enough to fuel weeks of calculated preparation, a motive so intimate and focused that it singled out one particular woman in one particular home within the vast Tucson sprawl, ignoring all others. Local officials have hinted that they possess a working theory regarding why this specific residence was marked for tragedy. Details remain shielded from the public, but the mere fact that the why is within their grasp suggests the net is tightening. The evidence suggests this was neither a random act nor a stroke of bad luck. It points toward the very psychological motive being scrutinized, something intimate, a targeted strike that had been set in motion long before the first ransom note was even conceived. And if that holds true, if the driving force was not profit, but a deeper, more specific malice, then the demands for money were destined to fail from the start. The failure wasn't due to a lack of funds, but because the individuals who breached Nancy Guthrie's sanctuary that night were never truly motivated by the payout. On March 23, 2026, marking 51 days since Nancy vanished into the night, the Guthrie children released a public statement via social media. Notably, they did not claim to still be searching for a survivor. They didn't speak of waiting for a forensic breakthrough or a miracle. They expressed a desire to honor her vibrant and brave existence, yet acknowledge that such a tribute remains impossible until she is laid in her final grave, until she is recovered, until she is returned home to her final resting place. That choice of words is chillingly precise and entirely intentional. In the depths of trauma, people instinctively reach for language that reflects their internal reality. They move past the facade of public hope and the performance of optimism, speaking instead the brutal truth that surfaces at 3 a.m. when the cameras are off. Her children utilize the vocabulary of finality of a chapter that has already concluded in a way the physical world has yet to formally acknowledge. 3 days later, Savannah sat down for her inaugural televised interview since her mother's abduction. She recounted the haunting dawn when she first realized her mother was missing. She detailed the blood discovered on the threshold in the security camera that had been violently torn from the exterior wall. She spoke of the nightly torment of visualizing her mother's ordeal, stating that while the thought of her mother's terror is agonizing, it is a psychological burden she cannot escape. She then described a moment of spiritual desperation, telling the heavens she could endure any hardship except the void of not knowing. Her words were stark. Regardless of whether her mother remains on this plane or has passed into the next, she carries a certain knowledge of her whereabouts. She claims to know whose hands her mother is in, yet the need for physical confirmation remains an open wound. There is a specific syntax to mourning that shifts as the psyche processes loss. There is the language of hope active, searching, and reaching for a survival that hasn't been disproven. And then there is the language of intuitive certainty, a quiet, internal realization that has already reached the end of the road. Even if the public record hasn't caught up, Savannah didn't speak of hoping for her mother's safety. She spoke of a grim certainty that likely carries the weight of every confidential briefing she has received, every hushed update from federal investigators, and every piece of sensitive intelligence shared with the family that the general public is not yet permitted to know. The daughter knows the truth. She simply requires the rest of the world to acknowledge it as well. She needs the forensic proof, the site, the identity of the perpetrator, and the arrest that would finally allow her family to fulfill their stated wish. To celebrate Nancy's life and lay her to rest, she announced her return to the morning news on April 6th, calling the move her current singular purpose. For years, Savannah has been one of the most recognizable fixtures of American broadcast journalism. To step back into that world of forced smiles, trivial banter, and lighthearted segments, to project the required cheer of morning television after the 2-month nightmare her family has endured, requires a level of psychological compartmentalization that few will ever understand. She isn't returning because the pain has subsided. She is doing it because maintaining a public presence and keeping the name Nancy Guthrie in the national spotlight is now her primary weapon. She will keep speaking and showing up to ensure the pressure remains on anyone who might hold a piece of the puzzle. 8 high-level investigators, weeks of documented surveillance, and a pacemaker that fell silent at exactly 2:28 in the morning. A ransom fund that sat untouched for 58 days while the nation watched, and a family that stopped asking for a rescue and started pleading for a burial. This mystery was never truly about a financial motive. The truth lies in the events that transpired before the first note was even written in the 41 minutes of darkness, between 1:47 and 2:28 a.m. That window is where the reality of this case is hidden, and the individuals who know exactly what happened in those 41 minutes are still walking free. If you possess any information, no matter how insignificant it may seem, regarding the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, please contact the Pima County Sheriff's Tip Line at 520-351-490 or the federal authorities at 1-800-CALL FBI. The family is offering $1 million, while the Federal Bureau has pledged $100,000 for information leading to her recovery or the capture of those involved. The answers exist in the mind of someone watching. The question is whether they have the courage to reveal them. If this deep dive provided a new perspective on the evidence or a detail that changed your view of the case, please subscribe and enable notifications. We will continue to investigate every shadow of this story as more information on Nancy Guthrie emerges. This inquiry is far from over, and the search for the truth continues. If an actual intruder were seeking valuables, we would find the debris of a typical break-in. Instead, the scene feels curated. Somewhere in the digital ether sits a specific cryptocurrency address, a Bitcoin wallet with a balance that remains a haunting zero. That balance has been empty since its inception, not through two deadlines, 58 days of public mourning, or the scrutiny of 8 investigators. Even after the family pleaded on national television, offering to pay whatever was demanded, the digital ledger remained completely stagnant. The entire world kept its eyes fixed on that digital vault. The funds never stirred. This inactivity holds a chilling significance, one that 8 career professionals from federal kidnapping and homicide units have analyzed extensively.